I'm going to focus primarily on biodiversity conservation, and I'm going to take the concept that has been mentioned, 30 by 30, and trace it from the international level all the way down to the state and local level. So you get some idea of what is happening in terms of voting and environmental issues at each of these levels. E.O. Wilson has been mentioned a number of times. In 2016, he published a seminal book on conservation of biodiversity across the planet called Half Earth. And in it, he said, if we're going to do anything to save biodiversity, we're going to have to protect 50% of the land and oceans on the planet with no intervention from humans to make sure biodiversity stays viable. That was in 2016. That idea was picked up quite rapidly by international conservationists around the world. In fact, and it became a concept known as first 50 by 50 because the idea was 50% protection by the year 2050. Some understood that that was maybe a little bit too large a step at this point, and so they adopted it, something called 30 by 30. That's 30% protection of the planet by the year 2030. And that idea of 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 has now been translated into a number of legislations and is going to be on the ballot more and more as far as I can see. The first action that happened was the Convention on Biological Diversity of the United Nations at their international meeting in 2022 in Montreal adopted 30 by 30 as their target 3, one of 23 targets, as one of the main aspects that the world needed to apply as soon as possible to stop biodiversity destruction. That was adopted and signed by the Global Biodiversity Framework by 196 countries around the world. So that was a major international effect in terms of biodiversity conservation. At the same time, our own government, through the current executive, as mentioned earlier by Anne, had initiated a couple of major bills, bipartisan bills, to support a lot of different things in terms of infrastructure and in terms of just living processes within the US. And one of those, or it also included millions of dollars for biodiversity conservation. In fact, in those bills, the idea of 30 by 30 was even mentioned explicitly. So the idea has caught on, not just around the world, but also in our own country. The next step forward after that was California, one of the largest and most economically important states in our country, starting in 2020, but then finally in 2022, adopted its own bill called called Pathways to 30 by 30 bill. This was a executive order by the governor of California that allocated $750 million to biodiversity conservation across the state, particularly to advance the idea of 30 by 30, and moving on to 50 by 50 after that is achieved. Vermont became the second state all the way across the United States, from California, the first state, to Vermont in the east, also enacted its own 30 by 30 bill just this past year. Vermont has been working on conservation for many years, and we're known as the Green Mountain State because of the amount of forests here and the amount of conservation that's going on, not only in forests, but also in agricultural land and other types of protection. This bill, called Act 59, which was just accepted about a year ago by the state legislature, was called Community Resilience and Biodiversity Protection Act. And it's explicitly, again, mentioned E.O. Wilson's Half Earth idea and the International Convention on Biological Diversity, their promotion of 30 by 30. This bill, interestingly enough, was not signed by the governor of the state. It still passed and became law in July of last year. So things do happen in terms of voting and in terms of environmental things on the ballot that are not always in the most direct way. I think I have another minute, and what I wanted to say was, well, to summarize, here we start with Harvard professor introducing the idea of half Earth. It goes on to the Convention on Biological Diversity and is approved target is approved, the US government, millions of dollars going for biodiversity conservation and 30 by 30, then goes on to the state of Vermont. So we see this progress of how we can achieve environmental protection from the international level. One more comment is this did not happen overnight in Vermont. And I just want to say as a Vermonter that this took 8 years. Even though the idea of 30 by 30 has been around, there are at least 5 or 6 different bills that were passed, different design plans, different allocations that happened before Act 59 came into being just a year ago. So I just want to encourage everyone to think about what they can do locally, nationally, internationally, to things like 30 by 30 concept. Thanks very much.